Hello, my name's Lesley Atherton and this piece of writing is called Next 10 Years. Neve was fast approaching her 50th. Something in her felt the need to pigeonhole and label herself and how she dealt with life. Something in her made her type into her Google search engine 50-year-old, and it brought her to the word quinquagenarian. Neve wasn't sure she could pronounce the word, but nevertheless, in another few months, that was exactly what she would be. And for now, all she could do was look back on the years that had recently passed and reel in amazement that she'd had the strength to survive. She tried not to think about most of the bad times nowadays, and mostly her efforts proved to be brilliantly successful. She worked hard, cared for her often challenging children, and enjoyed life, really she did. But she couldn't help thinking that there was perhaps a little more out there. Not more stuff, more money, that kind of thing, but something more life. That was what Neve needed and what she craved, more life. She wasn't thinking of adventure and distant travels. Unfortunately for her, and it irked her to admit it, she couldn't put a label on what she meant. But as a result of this craving that simply wouldn't leave her, she decided there was only one course of action she could take, the carrying out of a full and frank evaluation of her life as it stood, and the formulation of a plan to get it back on track with her ambitions, her needs, and her personality. Life was good, Neve told herself. Sure, it could be better, more interesting and more fun, but that was what happened when your children were still growing and weren't yet independent. A parent's independent life was put on semi-hold just for a little while, perhaps till the youngest started high school, and that was when it was time to live properly again. Neve's youngest was due to begin high school the month after Neve turned 50. If that wasn't an indication that something was about to change and needed to change, she didn't know what was. She retreated to her bedroom. The day had been an eruptive one, and so much was going on that she didn't quite understand how she fitted into the world anymore. The children were both happy and settled in their own rooms, and she needed time for herself. Many other people would light a candle and take a glass of wine up with them, but Neve needed light and clarity for what she was about to do. She was about to plan her next 10 years. On an A1 piece of card attached to a flip chart board, both borrowed from work, she began to write with a marker pen, again borrowed from work. Right in the centre of the board she wrote the words Neve's Plan and surrounded it with the shape of a thought cloud. Now was the time for a brainstorm. Words flashed into her mind. Singing in clubs, music, book covers, video production, writing, children, care, decorating, love, hate, learning to dance, romance, fit and healthy, decorate. She wrote them all down. Aims, she wrote them down. Pitfalls, she wrote them down too. Timelines, she made notes, crossed out and made adjustments. Within 2 hours, she was quite clearly in a position to say to herself, "Shit, I have no bloody direction at all." For, rather than the exercise focusing her thoughts and giving her aims and a future that she could be proud of, the exercise had done the entire opposite and brought to the surface all the stuff and nonsense that had been poisoning her daydreams for the last few years. Dreams she used to have that she occasionally wanted to try again, but that she suspected would never work, the club singing, for example. How could such a thing be viable when she was no longer a comfortable performer, since serious throat problems had damned her voice into nervous creakiness? What was needed was something more streamlined and less chaotic. So she went through her card and crossed out item by item those things she knew weren't feasible or that she didn't care all that much about. Dog walking business was crossed out, office admin business was crossed out, candle shop was crossed out. She needed to narrow things down to the apex of what she wanted, whether she realised it or not. And before she was even aware of it, the time was 11:45 p.m. The children had taken themselves to sleep and she was exhausted, perching on the edge of her bed, covered in smudges of marker pen. "I'll sleep on it," she thought, and did, near enough immediately. The next morning was all about the school run and getting work completed, and she barely thought about what her card might have said. It wasn't till 9 o'clock that she had the opportunity to find out. She'd got out of the bath, not too warm because a woman of her age really didn't need any additional encouragement to overheat, and into her comfiest cool cotton pyjamas, sat on the edge of the bed and turned over the piece of card. It flopped in her hand and made the sound of a wobble board. As she turned it over, she could see a mass of black scribbles, and at the centre of the crossings out was one phrase, underlined, starred and circles. Life's too short not to live it well. She could have cried. With resonances of her dad, who had written books about psychology and making the most of life, she had hit upon the biggest and most important factor. She was 50 years old. If she was lucky, she was already 2/3 through her life. Truly, should she always live her life thinking that the best was yet to come? Should it always be a case of doing something about the things that were no good when she got to retirement age, or when the kids left home, or whatever? No, the time to act was now. When you're at least 2/3 through your life, the time always should be now. She wondered why she'd never realised that before, but reckoned that most people were too busy living their day-to-days to consider the bigger picture. She was living on an earth full of humans who were too busy living their lives, whatever that meant, to really understand what it was like to really live a life well lived. That day became Neve's turning point. From that sleepy Thursday evening, she decided to say no to the committees she found stressful, and the evenings out she preferred not to partake in. She made decisions and moved on towards a life lived in the moment, each day mindfully, till the day she would die. She looked again at her brainstorm and began to write in a frenzy of creativity. 2 hours later, she read back what she'd written. She read it more than 100 times. It seemed so very simple. All she needed to do was to concentrate on the positives and on working towards her goals. But she couldn't help thinking, life wasn't always like that. It didn't always allow you to do what you needed. And then she caught herself. Allow? No way! Life wasn't going to do things to her. She was going to be her life and expand her life and love and live and enjoy her life like she never had before. And unlike in times gone by, she wasn't saying to herself that the diet would begin tomorrow and the writing would start at the weekend once she was more rested. No, life began at that moment, that very second when she was empowered to work on life and to make it happen. She got up from her sofa where she'd been for an hour and a half, just staring at the words on the page. She needed not to just sit and think about it and hope things would get better. She needed to get off her backside and work at what life required of her. And what life required was quite simple. Effort, enthusiasm, authenticity and determination. She was ready to begin with the rest of her life. She shook herself and sat in her desk chair. It was comfy, but not too comfy. It would do for now. She began to type. Once upon a time there was a man who was kind and good, the type of man that every child would want for their father. But this man had only one child, and she adored him. She stopped typing. That was it. That was where she would begin. She would tell the stories that children needed to hear, those that would bring hope and dreams into their lives. Tales that would give the readers heroes. Heroes that weren't even aware that they were heroic, like stars burning brightly in the heavens, entirely unaware of their own light emissions. Neve began to type again, and the typing continued at all times of the day and night, when she was able to fit it in between parents' consultations at school and other duties, picking up and dropping off, caring for other people's children, taking the dog for walks, cooking, clearing away, cleaning up, and life in general. It was all good, and she wasn't complaining, but it wasn't easy to keep going sometimes. Life was busy, and she sometimes resented the time she had to spend on the busy parts of her life. She wanted time spent on her loves and interests, not time spent on daily tasks. But soon she learned that it was these small experiences, these tiny moments, that made up the most part of her life, and she breathed her own creative energies back into them again. Life wasn't hard, life was challenging, and that was a good thing. Her story grew, and other stories did too, plus articles, webcasts, and so much content. She wrote about being happy, about parenting, about getting yourself free from debt, about making economical meals. She'd even set up as an online agony aunt. By the time of her 53rd birthday, she'd earned enough through her writing to pay for her once-in-a-lifetime trip to Iceland with the children. She was happy, and she knew the best was to come. Life was working out, as her plan had predicted, not through chance events, but because she'd worked to make it happen that way.